So we've all been here for the past 2 days or so, and we've heard a lot about the challenges our food system faces. 9 billion people to feed, soil salinity, climate change, and right now we're here to talk about the drought, and California just got through a major one, and more will be coming, and so we're trying to talk to the people who are at the heart of figuring out this issue and how to make sure we're able to feed 9 billion people. So we're having a great conversation backstage, and I wanted to start off with Dale. So you're the head of artichoke production, and I want to ask you, how did the recent drought impact your farms, and what were you doing to mitigate those issues?
Well, actually, we farm with recycled water here in the Castroville Seawater Intrusion Project, and so the drought itself didn't actually impact us like maybe it did some other folks up the valley. And between our recycled water and the well water that we are using, we're able to continue to farm and grow the crops we need to grow.
So can you talk a little bit about how you implemented this recycled water system back in the 1980s and some of the public perception issues you faced back then?
Well, back in the, seawater intrusion here in the Salinas Valley has been a problem since the 1940s. And where we're farming is right on the coast. And so when we started looking at using recycled water because of our intrusion problems, a study was done called the Monterey Wastewater Use of Reclamation for Agriculture. I can't remember exactly. It's called the Marissa study. That was a 10 or 11 year study that started in the mid-70s and proved that you could farm and grow vegetable crops and essentially eat them after having applied that water. In 1998, when we started using project water, there was a different perception than there is now. And so we as growers and shippers got together in late 1997, and we started talking about how we were going to do this. Because the last thing we wanted to do, given how interrelated agriculture is in the Salinas Valley, was to cause a train wreck. And so we took a passive-aggressive approach to the use of this water, meaning that we were prepared, we had all kinds of documentation, we had answers, but were any questions to come up, they were to be directed to the right people to give the right responses. As it turned out, there was never any question. In fact, I would say that our recycled water is one of the safest water supplies for irrigation there is in the world.
And now, Dan, can you talk about the system that you've been building and how it is now used on 4 million hectares around the world, including in Ukraine and Russia?
We formed a company 2.5 years ago, Farm QA, and we looked at this emerging market and said, applied technology to manage better, to give the brain and the eyes of the farmer something to be better and increase profit, is not reaching the marketplace. So we partner with a number. We also help develop some, and then we built a central software. And because the guys I partner with have been in agriculture for many years, I spend a third of my time in Ukraine and Russia, where the largest food production operations on the planet are located post-perestroika. And it doesn't take too long to add up to 4 million hectares there in just 5 to 10 organizations. In every single case, if you can come along, any production team of size can hire a person they think is the best at it and try to get him or her to the field as many times as possible to have consistent decisions made. But until we get sensors that can extend that common baseline, that they can trust, use, and use at speed, you have a tremendous risk of a drop-off of performance as it goes down the line. Doesn't matter who you are. So we saw fields overseas using pivot irrigation where one irrigated 8 times and one 3, and there was an $80,000 difference in yields in soybeans planted the same day, and it was the 3 that did better because they irrigated at the right times and went slower and used less water. And it was the other one that was worse because they didn't know what they were doing and used too much poorly. It varies tremendously. The plants need it at the right time. You can use sensors to do it. One of the saddest stories in agriculture is how much has been invested in water sensors, moisture sensors, that have failed to reach the market. Dale, for good reasons, isn't using any of them yet today, and he would be like most growers.
And we'll get back to that. Tomer, now you run an Israeli startup called CropX, which is one of the more innovative adaptive irrigation startups right now. So can you tell us a little bit about the product and the product that you will be launching soon?
Okay, thank you. First of all, you mentioned, or you rightfully mentioned, CropX is an Israeli company. It was founded in Israel, and the technology is coming out of Israel. And I think Israel is a good example as to how far you could actually get by fighting drought. Israel was founded as a country of drought. About 60% of the land is desert land. We have only 2 lakes in Israel, out of which one is the Dead Sea, and we get about 20 days of rain per year, and that's only in the northern part of the country. So despite all of the above, Israel today is, I think, the global leader in water desalination and water reuse. We are actually an exporter of water to some of our neighbor countries. And I think that's just kind of to set an example as to how far technology can take us with respect to water reuse and conservation and so forth. Now, CropX is actually one piece of that puzzle. So this is our water sensor. It has 2 depths of sensing, and it basically covers most of the broad acre crops, corn, potato, alfalfa, soybeans, and so forth. And I think that the most interesting part of this piece of technology is that we were really able to develop something that's a true do-it-yourself solution. You get this over mail, a farmer does, downloads the app, and puts it in the ground, and within minutes you start getting readings and results. And in fact, last week we broke our record. We had a customer down in the Denver area that installed 45 sensors in one day. I think that's just to show how easy the installation process is. The only thing that kind of took time was driving between the various installation locations. So this is the product, sensors to the mass. Next year's product is going to be even more exciting. We're going to, of course, continue the leveraging on the true do-it-yourself solution, but add significantly more sensing capabilities, essentially going just beyond water and talking also about fertilization, crop protection, and more.
And Dale, so your company doesn't use sensors right now, and you've tried them before. Can you talk about that, why your company isn't currently, and what would you need to see to want to adopt something like this?
First of all, I believe that I want to see our managers out in the field looking at the crops. And so when I'm with them, we got a shovel in the back, and I want to see exactly how that crop's going. I want to feel the moisture in that soil. And above all else, I want to make sure that that manager that I'm with sees and understands what I mean by wet. Because every single person in here has a different perspective when it comes to wet. And if you're in a certain soil trying to irrigate a crop and you think it's wet, but it ain't, then you're in trouble. And so the reason that we don't use these sensors is because they're inconsistent, the ones that we've used up till now, And these heavy soils, as they dry out, they have a tendency to crack, and they crack around these sensors. You get inconsistent readings. And you can't afford that in the kind of business that we're in. And so that's why we don't use them. One of these days, there'll be one there that we trust, and we'll take a look at it. But this smoke and mirror stuff and computer diagrams and all this crap that we see out there, it doesn't work when it grows the crop. And so we need something that works.
I just want to say that he never used Cropix.
I've never used that.
Okay, that's important to say. Never. Seriously.
So, Dan and Tomer, what would you say to a grower like Dale, and how would you convince him to want to use one of the sensors that's in your system or one of the Cropix sensors?
I'm sorry, I didn't get the question.
What would you say to Dale to convince him to want to use one of your sensors? We were also saying backstage, you both have had experiences where startup founders want you to put hundreds in an acre, and that's just not feasible. So
yeah, well, I think it all boils down to the value to the user, which is basically what you're asking. And I think the easiest example would be using perhaps pivot irrigation, and just one turn of a pivot costs about $400 to $500 just in terms of the energy that it takes to turn that thing around. And so if you're able to save just one spin, that by itself more or less paid for the entire use of the system. Now here in this area, I know that it's less about pivots and it's more about vegetable growing, and vegetable growers are essentially selling water, so I can very relate to the hesitation of perhaps skipping an irrigation cycle. But at the end of the day, my point would be, if you don't measure, you'll never know. And in addition to that, there's kind of the saving in labor, where you have to move sprinklers around, and then you have the cost of loss of yield that has to do with uniform irrigation. And once you have sensors deployed, so you suddenly know that you can irrigate differently in several areas of the field to maximize yield. And then you have a loss of quality that has to do with over-irrigating and under-irrigating. So all in all, and kind of to summarize perhaps everything I just said, I think it all boils down to sums up to about 10 to 20% in increased revenue or reduction in expenses.
Dan?
I think I really empathize, and if you go back through the history of sensors, it's very common for people to develop a sensor without an actual understanding of the field process that daily management through the life of crop goes through. And things like failing to have a product that will seal and consistently measure is a good example of developing a product without understanding how, once it's applied in an environment, it's going to be robust and work. We know many different kinds of sensors, and we choose to work with one. I don't like the term moisture sensor. When you look below the surface, what you really want to know is what's the health of the soil and the health of the roots. So there's more you can learn from watching water move than just the movement of the water. You can actually learn the depth and the health of the roots. And the truth is that these complex biological processes that happens when plants grow and in different soil types can be measured if the sensors are robust and adapted to the scale and speed that he has to operate. So there's far too many being created, and they reach the point where they've got to sell. They walk to see whether he'll buy them. They haven't completed all the testing that needs to survive a year, and then you have failures and discouragement. So yes, I do have one I'd be glad to show him, but we won't do an installation today on the stage.
So I want to talk about, I want to dig deeper into the scalability question, and how you work at overcoming decades of history that doesn't make you excited about using sensors and adapting to technology that's now coming out and is exciting? Each wonder.
Well, scale is, we work almost exclusively with large. So if you can do it with one plant on 1 square foot of one field, you then must be able to do it across a field, and then you must be able to do it across many fields at speed, at the pace that agriculture operates at. I think it's interesting to sometimes talk with folks who are managing the whole operation with brains and eyes, which is most of how we do it today. And you ask them how much is possible. There's really 3 answers. One is that they're skeptical that anything's possible, so it's better to start with the next guy first and let that man watch. The second is that they know that their worst fear is that their newest employee will cost them thousands of dollars. So the amount of time it takes to teach someone to have the kind of experience that you have, or for you to teach others, is the big challenge in managing. How do you keep bringing in that trained workforce? So if you can create a baseline, that's where there's great quick savings. And then the third is there really possible, if we bring manufacturing process control to the growing of plants, the measuring of water, the measuring of nitrates, measuring soil rapidly and simply, all of which can now be done, is it 10, 20, 30% more EBITDA in increased yield and decreased inputs and environmental process control and improved soil health that is possible? Because that's a goal that's really worth going after. There are some people seeing it, excited about it, and pursuing it.
And going off that, Tomer and Dale, can you both talk about the cost savings, with the recycled water and with the CropX system?
Okay, so I just want to add to the adoption thing and the scalability, and I kind of addressed the cost savings in the previous question, so I do want to add to that. I think when it comes to adoption, I distinguish between adoption of hardware and adoption of software. And on the hardware side, I actually think that if you create something that's kind of very simple, people understand it, it's easy to use. So from our experience, there are no real issues there. In terms of software, it's a bit more challenging because you need to create a software that addresses many different customer types. You have the more simple customers that are less technologically savvy, and then you have the more complex and sophisticated ones, farm managers. They want to see a view of their entire farm, be able to get a lot of data on there, see graphs and play with it and configure it and so forth. So it all kind of ends up at creating a very, very simple and smart UI. And when I say smart is simple. And one more thing that has to do with adoption. I'm a true believer that with these things that are very simple and are very low cost, we're going to see a new distribution channel arise when it comes to ag technology, and that's called e-commerce. I see many of our customers, they have the newest smartphones, they buy on Amazon, I see them on Facebook, and I think that it's only a matter of time until e-commerce becomes a very, very valid and substantial channel for selling these things online.
Dale?
Yeah, I'll just tell a little, you're going back here to before we had recycled water, because it really is important. First of all, we just didn't decide to start using it because it was a good thing to do. We started using it because we had to. And then we figured out how to be cost effective with it. The way the visionaries in our valley got together and decided to do this was to create zone of benefits. And so back in 1998, the interest rates were a lot higher than they are now. We expected cost of living increases that would be significant, and we'd be paying just a lot more for water, but that was our only choice. The first time that I went out and I opened that turnout, because the well that we had on some of these ranches, 1,000 gallons a minute, 1,200 gallons a minute. Down in the deep aquifer, maybe there was 2,000 gallons a minute. But when I opened that big barrel on that reservoir and she chucked out 5,000 gallons a minute, that changed our life right there. And so as we looked at that, I mean, I was like, yeah, this is like heaven for a grower, right? You got all the water you need. And it was. And so the cost at the time, and it still is, it's costing us in the project area about $230 an acre foot delivered, and another probably $70 an acre foot to boost. And we receive the water at 40 psi. And so our costs have maintained fairly consistent over the last 20 years. If we were to drill a hole into the deep aquifer now, it costs us $1.5 million to $2 million after it's all set. And what a difference it is. So we still have, we're using recycled water. We continue to use it. We, as chairman of the Water Quality and Operations Committee, as the grower, we're making sure that the quality of that water is what we need it to be to grow the crops that we have. And as growers, I can't just really how important that is. One of the things here, we talked about this a little earlier, was what kind of measuring things are you using and what are you looking at? Well, I haven't seen one yet that tells us anything about the crop until it's too late. And if we're talking head lettuce, for instance, and all of a sudden here you have a drone up there and it sees that crop is deficient in something, it's too late. We've already lost yield. We can't correct the problem fast enough. And so we need to know these things sooner than later so we can make those changes in what we're doing. Because the last thing you want to have is a crop that's costing you $5,000 an acre, or in the case of strawberries, maybe it's $25,000 an acre, and you lose because you couldn't make a decision fast enough on what you need to change. That's really important.
And Dan, just to go off that point, you do work with sensors, but what do you still want to see in a new product?
So I'm spending most of my time on things that can subclinically see something happening before you see the physical manifestation. So can we look and see plant chlorophyll? Can we look and see internal quality using spectrometry? Can we measure tissue and soil in minutes or overnight so that we can get samples and analysis and respond to them instantly? Can we see disease coming before it's going to manifest itself because we can predict the environmental conditions are right? And the answer to all of those questions is either yes now or we're close. That kind of identifying non-conforming events before they happen is how you create real yield gain. If you're seeing it after it's a problem, Dale's right. You can't. All you can do is observe your pain.
So I want to have time for questions, but I just want to ask each of you before we go to questions, what makes you excited about farming in the future, even considering future droughts to come and technological advances and hurdles to get over?
I think that there isn't any question it can be more profitable. If you are in farming today, it is possible that you can have an increased set of management practices, even despite some of the massive factors we face, some of them unfriendly in our own government or culture towards us. But I think there's a lot of opportunity. I think these technologies can significantly improve what's happening.
And I agree. I mean, when there's something that works, we'll definitely start using it. I think from my perspective, looking at things as a grower, there's so many things that we're facing right now, especially in the state of California. Whether it's labor, but layers and layers of regulation that continue. It's so complicated that we can hardly understand it. we have to hire experts to try and explain it to us because we don't know how to comply with this regulation or that regulation. And it's coming at us from all directions, more than I've ever seen. And so, having said all that, people have to eat. And we are in business, we're in business, we have to make money, we have to cover our growing, we have to get money back, we have to stay in business. And I think there's great opportunity out there for young people that want to work and get ahead. And there's just no doubt about that. So that's just...
So before I answer, I just want to relate to a point that I find as very important that you just said about data being too little, too late. And I think that it's very important to distinguish between data that's coming from above the soil and below under the soil. And above the soil essentially is data coming from UAVs, drones, satellite imageries, pictures that are coming from cameras that are put on weather stations and so forth. And when you take imagery, essentially you're always too little, too late, because by the time you see something that has happened on the plant or on the soil, it's already happened and the plant is already suffering. And that is to distinguish from data that's coming from under the soil, from within the soil, and that is where the true predictive data resides. Now, it's a much bigger challenge getting the data out of there. Essentially, that is Cropex's vision, to become the lab in the soil. But I think that the data that comes out of there can be much more useful in terms of being predictive. Now, getting back to your question about what excites me most, I think first of all, taking a look at AgTech, it's very clear that the kind of informational revolution is really hitting AgTech at the moment, and things that we've already experienced in other industries such as communication and internet and aviation and so forth, things like machine learning and use of big data modules and so forth, and even e-commerce that I just mentioned before, are all starting to align and get into place and being applied also here. And lastly, I think that, or perhaps I'll end with a real-life story. What excites me most is when I see, how much we don't know and how much information helps. And it's very often that we get customers calling us and saying, listen, I installed the sensor. I had an irrigation event yesterday. It seems that the upper sensor seems to be showing me some kind of a reading, but the bottom sensor isn't working. So we always say, okay, just wait a day and we'll call you tomorrow to make sure that everything's okay. And we call back the day after, and indeed in 99% of the cases, there's also a reaction at the bottom sensor, which is to say that it just takes time for water to percolate down the soil, and in fact 18 inches can take up to even 24 hours. But it's just that the same growers that have been irrigating the same way for decades are not necessarily aware of the time that it takes. And all of a sudden we know more things, so we can react and make better decisions.
I think we have time for one question, if anyone's around.
Lance Donnie on farm. Dale made a great point early on that I want to touch on, which is most growers today use their intuition, their knowledge about how to water to make that decision. And they don't trust oftentimes the data that comes off a sensor, right? So there's a trust gap between what they know and what the data shows them. And that trust gap creates the hurdle for adoption of technology, right? So what I'd like to know is, how do we solve or bridge the gap?
Earn it. You gotta find a way to get out there with the man and really convince him and earn it, including the pain he's been through in the past.
Yeah. The way that we're trying to deal with this is actually create a sensor that is inexpensive, and in that respect almost risk-free. It doesn't have to connect to anything else. You just can try it, use it for a very minimal effort, and it's very obvious and apparent to us that the first year every grower would be kind of testing the sensor and want to see that it works properly. But after another year, we believe that the trust will already be there, it will be in place, and then we expect significantly easier adoption with each and every grower.
Great. Well,
how would you address inconsistencies in the data? In many cases, perhaps the sensor might work, but there's interruptions in the transfer of the data over either a cellular network or a private network. What would happen, for example, if you had only 25 days of reporting, and obviously you are missing roughly a week in a month? Now you're going to try and base irrigation on those inconsistencies. You're setting yourself up for failure. So how do you make this more reliable?
You're correct. The problem has to be solved. Robust sensors that don't lose comm and enhanced antennas and tools have to be delivered so that you can actually you're correct. You have to have good, solid, consistent data to do it. There have been a lot of products that have gone to the market without the level of testing and environmental experience that they need to hold up, and that's unfortunate. It has caused plenty of pain. But comm can be delivered. We very rarely have that type of problem with any of the things we work with, but we quality test and assure them before we ever bring them to the field and put them through the set of protocols that they need.
The way I see it, as soon as you have a sensor that's very inexpensive, you just deploy many sensors. And it's an entirely different picture if you have a pivot with 2 sensors across the pivot, or you have 12. And since it's life sciences, there will always be issues, installation issues, you hit a rock, anything can happen. But if you have 12 sensors on the area of a pivot, then the total kind of image that you're receiving on your field is still a very reliable picture.
thank you guys.
Done?
Thank you guys.